So, in starting this, I want to share just a little bit of context. But before I do that, um, I know Charles just prayed for us. I'd like for us to just take a moment to bring ourselves all the way here. It's for us to pray, but like more in like a sense of like we were just doing something else. We were just grabbing lunch, talking with someone, processing something with our family or our kids. There's a lot going on, and doing gatherings like this on Zoom doesn't create a lot of space for margin at times. And so we're doing one thing and then we're immediately in another thing. And so I just wanted to say, like, let's take a moment to just breathe into being present here and letting go of the other things uh, for just a moment, because it's such an honor that you would give your time, which is, I think, one of the most precious things we have right now is this is our time with each other. And so I'm just going to invite you to, you can turn your camera off if you choose, or you can just be present with it. That's fine either way. I'm going to do just a few breaths and then um, and I'll guide you a little bit, and then we'll come back and we'll begin talking about thriving and what does it mean to thrive in ministry today in 2021. So here we go. Just begin by closing your eyes, centering yourself, finding a comfortable space in your chair, wherever you are. If you're in your car listening to this, and don't close your eyes if you're in the car. Just being able to breathe in and out, all the way. We know that God is present with us. Spirit is speaking to us. Breathe in God's presence and out all the things, the other experiences of the day that we can come back to in just a little bit. Lord, we thank you that you meet us in this space. We thank you that you want to speak to us, that you are already speaking to us, and that you are reminding us of what you are already up to. Lord, we ask that you would continue to remind us of the things that are needed for later in the day, for tomorrow and the next day, but that at this point we'd be able to be centered here with what your Spirit has to say, that you would speak to us through me and through my friends and colleagues here. We're so honored to have this conversation, that you would want us to thrive, that you actually call us to thrive, not just to survive from day to day. Thank you for this space. I want to begin by sharing with you a little bit about what I do, because you may or may not know what I do. And you can turn your video back on if you choose. I always love seeing faces. So if that feels good to you, appropriate to you, then you're welcome to. I change the way I view it so I can see you all, because I appreciate that. So my work is that I get to direct an Institute for Pastoral and Congregational Thriving at Portland Seminary. And I've been doing that for, about 4 years now. And doing that sometimes alongside pastoring at a local church and sometimes not. And then I also have the opportunity to coach pastors and leaders in their own sense of calling and vocational clarity, helping them be strategic and how they activate that in their own life, in their context. So those are a few things I do. The main work, the main focus that I wanted to consider today was on our Institute for Thriving, particular the pastoral thriving side of it. So the Institute for Pastoral and Congregational Thriving is based out of 2 different grants from the Lilly Endowment out of Indianapolis. And our Institute for Pastoral Thriving, our Thriving in Ministry focus, is all around local pastors within the Northwest. There are several grants that are given or have been given. I believe Westmont has one and Azusa Pacific has one. I'm trying to think of all. Cal Lutheran has one. I think in the areas in Southern California that have the same type of grant from Lilly, to really focus around how pastors thrive today and helping pastors in their local community to thrive and have well-being in their work, so that they would align their calling with their context well, and that they would have space to do their good work in a way that creates meaning in life, not just for them, but then also for their congregation and then their larger context. And so I want to share with you a little bit of information from Notre Dame, from Matt Bloom and their work. That's part of what has prompted this grant originally. And I think it's a little bit fascinating. It's a lot fascinating to me, because some of this work comes, well, a lot of it came pre-pandemic. And so in many ways, to me, the work is just double down. It's just even more necessary because there's so much more that's happening and happened since. And then I'll share with you a little bit about what it looks like in our context, what we're doing in our Thriving Institute. So before I can tell you much about Notre Dame or what we're doing, I want to also share with you my hope for our time. So my hope is that I would be able to share with you a little bit about this research, and that I would connect you or help you to connect more deeply with who God has made you to be, and to come into alignment, maybe even more clearly with your sense of called identity, and to be able to support your team or your context in living the same, that you would live out what thriving means within your context a little bit more today or in this next season. And so I'll share some research. I'll share about our team, what we do. I'll share about a few different practices. We're going to do a few different practices together today. So I will not be speaking to you the whole time. I think that it's much better if you get to practice and take on some ideas and things and try them out and see how they work or don't for you. And then also I'm going to invite you to ask questions about my work, about with what we're doing, about the outcomes. You can ask about my story. I'm happy to say no if I don't feel comfortable answering something. But you're welcome to ask a lot of questions. Please feel free to utilize the chat. Even if you're watching this back later, feel free to comment, and we'll see if we can respond to that even post this live conversation. And I don't intend to say a lot that's new to you today. I don't think I probably have much new to say. My hope is that I can say some things that recall what God is already speaking, that maybe you already know, and it's like, oh yes, or aha, or something that reminds me of that thing I learned in that pastoral counseling class 15 years ago, or in this one experience with ministry and this thing. And oh yes, this was what I felt called to when I first had that sense of calling. It's realignment in my mind and what God is doing. I hope that will be the core of it for you. So, okay, so here, let me share with you a little bit about the research and the work from Matt Bloom and their team. So Notre Dame has done quite a bit of research surveying pastors and leaders, also people in the mental health field and the medical profession, as well as technology. So they've done quite a bit of research around people who have a lot of stress in their life, a lot of intense things happening in their life. And what they found with regard to pastors is that there are some particular trends around their work today. One is that pastoral work has changed. Now, think about this 2 years ago. Pastoral work changed a lot 2 years ago, or had already changed a lot. And now in 2021, it's changed quite a bit, way more than we expected it to have changed, I think. And then congregations have changed. Of course, our congregations continue to change as we see millennials and Gen Z and all the different scope of how things change. And then you add a pandemic and you have more change. And then one thing they hadn't seen change, but I would say that this has changed a lot. And I've been watching as we've been in cohorts with our clergy and clergy across mostly the West that I've been working with, but not just the West, is that job satisfaction had stayed the same generally pre-COVID. But then I would say it's changed a bit to where job satisfaction is not quite the same because it's been so tumultuous. And there are reasons for that. But one of the ways that they started to see below the surface of that is that when they dug a little bit deeper, that they found a lot of frustration with underfunded retirements and educational debt and inequities in leadership and opportunities and even policies. There are all these different things that started to come up from under the surface. And it seemed like everything was good, but then they realized there's more that's happening under the surface. And now I think maybe it's less under the surface. And sometimes pastors are saying, this is too much. It's overwhelming to me. And they're not knowing how to cope or support themselves with some of the experiences and even trauma that they might be experiencing. So the three primary issues for pastors tend to be professional and personal isolation tends to be a norm, weak support structures. So thinking about boards, leadership policies, mentors, different structures that support pastors in their own well-being. And then also the need for discernment and how to engage ministry well with so much changing. And maybe this hits home a bit more currently, is that a major issue is how do I discern what to do and when to do it, and how to move and change with the times, or where do we need to stay and hold true. I was just in a conversation with a pastor this morning who is discerning all of that. They're having strategic conversations every week since the pandemic. And they said it's just exhausting to have strategic conversations where we're having to consider COVID guidelines and think about this every single week. And maybe there are new or other ways that they could outsource that or strategize around that to let go of some of the burden of that for themselves. But the discernment for them, it's taxing. And so one of the ways that Bloom and their team found that pastors flourish is when they find themselves in communities of competent practice and that they have access to exemplars or wise guides. And I would even say that, and this is what we have seen and learned from our own experience, is that they would have wise guides that could be their colleagues, but often not at their same location. So having people who are in their same or similar setting that like in a different location that maybe they do not know, but they're like peer mentors, peer colleagues kind of a thing. But there's a bit of safety in that they don't wear multiple hats with one another, to where they're not one another's boss, or one of them's on the MEG board or something like that. So some differences there and some safe space there. And then I want to share with you a little bit, just based out of that, what it's looked like. Because sometimes adding stories to this, adding experiences and actual experiential learning helps to understand, like clarify and understand a little bit more what this looks like. So with Portland Seminary, what we have done, we wrote our grant toward creating one-year cohorts with pastors. Our institute was focused around helping them to thrive in their sense of calling, but really thrive in their own well-being, knowing that most pastors don't take breaks or have a lot of extra ways that they can support themselves that are not just vacation. So it's like, oh, if I take time off, it's vacation. And so we created cohorts where we wanted them to get away from their context and be supported in a way that they would have other peers with them who were different from them. And then that they would be away for not just a day, but for nearly 4 days. Every May, we take them away. And then in this fall, we actually do a one-day symposium with them where we connect them again with one another in person if we are able. And then again, the following May. So they have kind of a bookend experience of a May cohort for 4 days. They have a fall gathering and then another May cohort that they get to be a part of. We have all of this application-based, and then we protect each of our cohorts to where we have a general cohort and we have a specialized cohort. So we've run, I think, 6 or 7 of them now, of these different cohorts. We've had a Korean cohort was one of our specialized cohorts. We currently have a women pastors cohort. We have a have just finished our Grupo Latino cohort. And then we will next year start a cohort of African descent. And then we have our general cohorts that run alongside each of those typically. And all of those cohorts are no more than about 10 people. They're evenly male and female in each cohort. They're all pastors, and they come from a wide variety of backgrounds in the way of race and ethnicity and denomination. And there's a lot of variance. Most of the pastors that come together don't know one another. Some of them are lead pastors, some of them are not. So there's a whole lot going on in these dynamics. But what we have found in doing this, and why I share this with you, is what has happened in these experiences has been just phenomenal learning for us, but then also the experiences of these leaders has been incredible. We're curating a safe space for them to connect with God, but also really they connect with God a lot in their context, or they attempt to at least, but then also for them to connect with themselves and who they are, to get space away to be able to think deeply or just to sleep a bit more and to reconnect with themselves, and then also to connect with others who understand them, who really have a sense of like, oh yeah, I understand what you're walking through, but without trying to fix them. So we try to hold that too. So then we also create, our hope for them is that we create sustainable professional and personal friendships for them. So we have a Facebook group and some other different methods that we try to create support for them throughout the year. But in creating these cohorts, when we take them away to the beach, we do very minimal programming. Like in the mornings, we have worship, we'll have one workshop, and then we have breakfast together, and then we have lunch with the cohort. And it's usually a long lunch. If we can be together and have a long lunch, we will. And then we give them all of the rest of the day until dinner to do whatever it is they feel is best for them to do. We offer spiritual direction for them if they so choose that. And then they come together and they have a meal every evening together as a cohort. And again, it's kind of a long dinner, a long meal where they can just be present and get to know one another's stories. And we do some very particular practices in our workshops with one another. And I'll explain one of those in just a moment. But those are a few of the things that we've done. Trying to think, I'm looking at my notes because I want to make sure that I include some of the things that I thought have been very beneficial in what we've learned in our experience, our reporting back to Lily as we do this work. One aspect is that it has been extremely beneficial for pastors to be in safe space with other pastors. So not competitive with one another, which often means they don't know each other. I know I've mentioned this, but that's why. And they don't know what the other people, they don't know their cohort before they come. And they don't know what the other people's role, how many people are in their church. That's not part of the conversation that we have with one another. That way they're able to just process their ministry experience. They're starting to just ask questions about, oh yeah, like what, like they're actually not asking so many questions as much as they're sharing their own stories first with one another. And then we do the pastors have a sense of identity that often gets wrapped up into their role or their title. That happens. We see that often. Oh, I didn't realize that my being a pastor is how I'm identifying my whole life. And I'm having a hard time identifying as anything other than my job. And so we've had pastors that they've been in a lot of transition in these spaces where they have lost their job or the church has changed, or there's been lots of transition for them in the way of what roles they have. Sometimes there's other experiences of transition, but there's a lot of questioning of identity that happens in those spaces too. And so for them to be able to process that with one another and with their spiritual directors and such. I could share a lot more. I've also noticed, and I think this is something that hits home on all the levels, is that the well-being of our own team determines how well we support our pastors. And so we realize that where we're at matters. And we need to not just expect them to thrive and be well while we then are having all of these other things going on in our life and we don't have the support. We still need the same things that they do. We're not exempt from that. And I saw that personally in 2019. I experienced that when we had a videographer with us, and they took a whole video of different things we were doing and our experiences. And I looked back at it and I went, gosh, I look sad. I just looked sad. And I realized there was a lot. I mean, I knew it, but I couldn't see it. It was like I'm holding a mirror to myself. And I went, oh, well, we'd had a major family trauma of loss that affected every person in our family deeply, to where many of us went to therapy. I was in the midst of writing a dissertation. I had a 9-month-old. I was ending a job at a church. My house was on the market. Like, this is some change. That's some wild things happening. And this is not even 2020. And so those were things that I was experiencing. And I went, oh my, like, I was doing my best where I was to be able to support our pastors and getting the support I needed. But in that next season, I bolstered the support that I had, because I realized I'm not thriving. Like, there was a lot going on. Some things that I could not change, and some things that I could. And so there was some processing for me and reflection in that of what do I need in this season, this next space, to thrive as a pastor, as a leader for these other pastors. So that is just a quick snapshot of some of what we're doing. I want to take a pause before I say any more, because I've spoken for a little bit of time here, and invite you to ask any questions. If there's something you want clarification on, if there's something that you're like, oh, this is interesting, could you tell me more? Or I want to push back on that. I am open for all of that. Anything that's like, anybody that's sitting here with us now in the live conversation, can you say more? Or here's my experience of this.
Trish, if I may, I believe this is probably one, in terms of members or students of the cohort, how are they enlisted or registered? Are they referred? Do they volunteer or required? How does a pastor find herself or himself
Yeah.
in one of your cohorts?
That's a good question, Charles. So what we have done is we have an application form. So it's on our website at the seminary, and we've invited people to apply. But now we know that there are certain people who will know. We put it out on Facebook, we put it in all these different spaces, and there are certain people who will not know about what we're up to. For example, always more men apply than women apply. Like, they just happen to know. A lot of pastors, local pastors, they're just connected in ways that sometimes the women, they're just focused in on what they're up to, and or for whatever reason it is, I'm not sure. So what we do is we do application, and then we hold space open. So we always protect the cohort every time, because we want it to be equitable. And so as much as we might have one particular demographic that we have 50 applications for, we make sure that we still have, and we will go out and ask our network. We do this almost every time. We ask our network of pastors that we've had through our other cohorts and who are in the city, and just the network of who we know. Hey, do you know anyone? We really would love to have a Latina pastor join us, or 2 or 3. Could you share with us some names so we can invite them to apply as well? And so we do that every time, because we don't have a majority of a demographic typically, not by much, not by much usually. And so it's both and. We have people apply, and we hold space, and we welcome people to continue to apply that we are asking to apply, and we're inviting into that space. And then our team goes through and processes through the applications together. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one other. Have you noticed in your research and in the times you've gotten together, have you noticed pastors, I would guess, come on board or sign on or apply early in their challenge experience or in the red zone of their challenge experience? Or do you get kind of like a mixture of both, early onset or things about to go dark,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've had pastors who, I mean, one pastor showed up and when he applied, this hadn't happened. When he came, he had lost his job that week at his church. We didn't know that was happening. Um, we have one pastor who just recently, when he was with us, like, I mean, I'm thinking of multiple of them. They just didn't realize that they're experiencing burnout. They just didn't know. And one of them, they had somebody else who'd been in a previous cohort that said, please apply. We want you to be there. And they applied and we welcomed them in. And yeah. So, and then we have people who are just kind of in the midst, I would say mid career, not too many who are in their like early 20s. Mostly I would say pastors that are in their late 20s at the earliest, typically, all the way into 50s. Our general range. Other questions? Yeah, Denny.
Trish, have you tried one denominational cohort where they do know each other?
Yeah, we had that on our radar. We had planned, we were thinking about doing not quite one denomination, but we were going to do a Wesleyan cohort, and because I'm Wesleyan, and so we were going to do that. And then we were thinking about doing a charismatic Pentecostal cohort because one of my other colleagues she's Foursquare, and we decided not to because of mainly one reason: we didn't have enough time and money. Because we're paying these pastors to be here, we have to use all this money in 5 years. And so we went, well, we can only facilitate so many cohorts at a time, and we only have so much. And so we wanted to focus on these particular ones. But it was part of our original plan, was to do that. Not a single denomination, although I actually personally am curious about doing something like that, because I think you can still create the safe space to do it. I've been a part of gatherings with other pastors where it's been safe. And I feel like that is really the crux of it, has to be safe with one another, to be able to be yourself and to be able to experience the rest and restoration that you need. Yeah. Have you done anything like that, Denny?
Oh, we had about every 6 weeks, we got our pastors together.
Like for a day?
Yeah. Well, we would have kind of like your same thing. We would come together, have some breakfast stuff, and then do one seminar on something, then a prayer time, and then a lunch together. And it was, I didn't think that it was detrimental that they knew each other. I thought the opposite. And so I just wondered if you had had an experience of that. It is, very different experience to go to our clergy associations in our towns and everybody's there. And for me, they're very shallow. Now, if they're directed by Lily and you, then it'd be great.
Yeah, I think that's what the difference has been, is that because in particular, we wanted Black women and we wanted Asian men and we wanted white people, like we wanted all of these different demographics. We knew we'd need to curate it, because we knew we couldn't just accept anyone that was going to come. And if everybody knew one another, I mean, I know based on my own research from my dissertation and such with our Wesleyan communities, like we're primarily white. And so that's who's going to tend to show up. And then it becomes, the curiosity is what tends to leave the room, because there's a sense of assumption or knowing. That's what has been so phenomenal to me to watch with these cohorts, is that we're creating and curating this space, but then we're also, we know that these pastors don't know one another, and there's a lot of curiosity. We invite them to be curious about one another. And so then they're learning from people who are very different from them, who have very different ministry experiences than them. And there's, I mean, I have multiple stories at the top of my mind of what our pastors have experienced with one another. And we end every gathering, every retreat with prayer, like with a whole space of prayer at the front of a church. And we just tell people you can pray in your heart language, pray how you feel most comfortable, feel free to lead out. We leave a lot of space there, but that, after them spending all this time with one another, that is the part that I'm like, this is the best thing we do because they are the ones leading and supporting and praying over. And some of them are like, I don't do tongues, I don't do that stuff. And others are like totally in for it, but they hold one another. And it's really incredible. I see, Paul, you had asked me a question. So I'll try to respond to that. I said that people thrive when they're in community of competent practice. That's true. You got that correct. Have you had this in any kind of church and organizational setting? Thanks. Yes, I've had this. I mean, I have seen this in my work with our program. Like our team, our thriving team, has been an incredible team to work with. I've seen this in the church at different points. I've seen this in other churches, for sure, that there's like a lot of incredible people. There's always space where there's growth edges and challenge, of course, but yes. So the short answer of that is yes, Paul. Okay, so there's been a bit of space for questions and processing a little bit about what we do. I thought it would maybe be helpful to share with you a bit of what we do so that way you have a sense of where I'm coming from and how we're activating this in our location. I want to invite you into doing something that we tend to do with our group when they first gather. And so this is around identity and story. So we realize, and part of the research that we've seen and time and again, is that pastors really need to get to have a clear, have a sense of the clarity around their life narrative. And I say get to because we don't always choose it. But our hope is that pastors would unfold their pastoral role within their life narrative. You weren't a pastor when you were 5. That wasn't part of it, unless you were playing pastor with your dolls. I know many a person who has preached to their dolls. I was not one of those. But that is not all you are. And so every pastor has a pastoral role or that title at different points in their life, or maybe that's part of their character, that they're a nurturer. That's me. I tend to be a nurturing, discipling pastor that tends to want to bring people in and kind of have them come alongside, but that's not always my title. And so there's a little bit of a shaking those loose from one another. And so what I'd like to invite you to do for the next about 10 minutes is I want to give you some space to write just for yourself. And then we're going to do some triads where you're going to be able to share just what you feel comfortable with. And so, and I know Chris will break us up into either 2s or 3s, whatever makes sense. And we'll get there when we get there. I'll explain that. But before we go into, and I give you a little bit more instruction on how to do this, I want you to think about your identity as rooted in your brain as a story, as a life story. You don't just have a bunch of facts that make up who you are, your age and your gender and your education. That's not how you even see yourself, really. It's that you are all of these experiences that have been your life. And you are the central character in your own story that you are authoring with God, of course, led by the Holy Spirit, we hope. All of this is happening together, but really this life narrative is it's your story, and the way that you tell it, you live into it. It's a little bit of that self-fulfilling prophecy at times. But it becomes this living autobiography that we are adapting and writing every single day. And so one other note about that is that having a sense of your life narrative is a really effective way to deal with the trauma and to help other people write and rewrite their story. And I would say that Pastor Denny could say a lot more to that, so I won't. And other psychologists could say speak more to that. But helping people to really clarify who they are and to heal through understanding and really to align with their calling to that understanding of who they are from adolescence or early life to then midlife or young adulthood, and then into their current experience or later years. I tend to think early, mid, and current. Whatever you identify those as, I my hope for you in this next little space of 10 minutes is that you would take a few moments um, to journal or write, even if it's in bullet points, in about the most significant points in your life that have impacted or changed your direction in early life, midlife, and current. And um, so I'll put that actually in the chat so you can see it. And then ask yourself, how did each of these events shape who I am today? Okay, go ahead and wrap up your last little bit there. You always have the opportunity to come back to this and continue to process through the experiences that you've had, um, the major and formative experiences, both positive and negative, that we experience. So thanks for taking the time to do that. Now, what the next piece of this, the purpose of this in part is for us to examine who am I? Like to ask these 4 questions. There's kind of 2 sets. One is who am I, and who am I in the world? Like how does the world see me? How am I placed within the context of the greater world? And then second, who am I as a pastor, and who am I as a pastor in the world? And those are different questions. You have, who am I as a pastor? What's my identity? And how is that experienced contextually? So the next piece of this, what I'd like to do with you all is invite you to share the answer to those questions. So you don't need to share all of the experiences that you've had in your early, mid, and current life experiences. But what Chris is going to help me with is we're going to break you into groups to where we do this thing that we tend to do. Now, this is the experiment for me that Denny has done on the regular with having groups of people who may know one another who are from the same denomination. And so my hope is that we create this, we curate this in a way that gives you an opportunity to share what you feel comfortable, but then also that you can get to know someone else and their experience that is going to be different. It is different than yours. And so what I'm going to do is invite Chris to break us into breakout rooms. I'll put some norms for you to mind as you are in that conversation with one or two others. So you'll have 5 minutes to share each. And if there's only 2 of you, you can share a little bit longer, but please make sure that you do not overshare, that you moderate your own voice. And then that you will share your response to who am I in the world? What are the themes? What are the things that you saw as you wrote down your life experience? Who you are, and who are you as a pastor? Who are you with your family? Like, who are you in the world? Welcome back, all of you. I know some of you may not have realized you were going in a group, potentially Latch and John. Hey, so everybody gets to do this experience. Well, welcome back. I'm glad you all had the time to do that. My follow-up question for you, and I would say, let's start by putting this in the chat. Like if you are able to do that, the first word that comes to mind when you hear me ask you these questions, what was your experience of one another? So what was your experience of the others who are with you? Just a one word, your experience. Compatibility. What other experiences do you have? Divine connection. That's great. You can have 2 words. That's nice. Divine connection. Enlightening. Other words. What experience did you have of one another? Intimate. Listening. Similar stories. Yeah. I think we realize we have more in common at times, right? Where there's lots of learning. Feel free to continue to add as I ask these next questions. You can just respond. What did you learn about yourself? I'm going to put that in the chat. Is there anything that you learned about yourself? One word, a couple words, it's okay. You don't have to give a depth of what you've learned. You may already know all these things, but even in the way that you presented yourself to your colleagues, what did you learn? Context matters. Yeah. God is faithful. That's good. Good word. God has been near all the time. Good. And then, what did you learn about your colleagues? What is something you learned that was new to you? Don't put their name in it. Just what did you learn about someone else who you were listening to? PKs, God is awesome. What did you learn? What was new for you? New learning from someone that was speaking to you, capable and sincere. Life ministry fuels passion for ministry, or life experience fuels passion for ministry. Good. Our story is what we lead from. The power, I want to read these other ones first. The power of being teammates in ministry. I can trust them because they my own story. I can trust them because I think I'm getting what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure, Jonathan. If you want to explain, feel free. They own my story, or that they know my story. Our story is what we lead from, or to put it another way, we lead out of who we are. Our body, our mind, our soul, strength, all of those things. Those words are familiar to us in the Shema. And so we know that we love the Lord with all of who we are, but who we are is how we lead. And it's not just our education or our skill set. Like, our education and skill set help us to do our good work, but we tend to lead out of what's happening in us a lot of times. So if we are an anxious presence in the world, we lead out of that. And if we are at peace, then we lead out of that. And that's what I experienced a couple of years ago when I was leading from a place where I realized, I was sad. There was a lot, there was trauma, there were things happening in my own life. And I needed some support. I couldn't just depend on the things that I was doing educationally or my skill set to hold me. I needed more than that. And that's true for all of us. We cannot care for others in ways that we don't care for ourselves, or say it differently, how we care for ourselves is how we care for others. That's what we're leading out of, the well or the dry well. that we have in our own life. And I mention this because our stories really matter, and they help us to know our history and the thread of where we've come from, to then know more clearly our identity today, to then walk into the future, understanding what is it that we might need to thrive. Oh, am I assessing to where I realize I'm surviving, or am I thriving? Where am I at in that spectrum? And I wanted to do this. I'm not going to do a second exercise, but really asking some questions. I'll give you a whole sheet that has this exercise on it, so you can do it on your own time. It has several different questions, but it's around resilience in ministry and how we continue to thrive or to assess our well-being towards thriving in ministry. One aspect we were just talking about was the community. Like, we're creating space for wise guides in this conversation, but then there's a whole nother experience that of what practices do we import, or what do we assess towards moving more healthily into our future. But before I even talk a little bit more about that, I want to consider takeaways from this experience. With the cohort of people, the mini group of 2 or 3 that you were meeting with in your groups, this is potentially a new experience. It's maybe something you've done often, or over your ministerial history or life history. But I'd like you to consider one way you could follow up from this experience to deepen your sense of meaning in your work or your life. So you just shared your story, like in a snapshot, like 5 minutes, or maybe a couple more than that, with someone else. How might you connect or stay connected with the meaning that God, the faithfulness of God that has happened in your past, towards continuing forward intentionally to deepen that sense of meaning and connection in your current ministry or current life experience? And I'll throw out a couple ideas for you. Perhaps you could practice this with your team. So your leaders, your colleagues at your context. You could share your stories and just listen for one another, listen and hold one another, pray over one another, give supportive, honoring feedback to one another after listening. Perhaps you could reconnect with one of the people that you were just chatting with, realizing there's something in common that you have, or that you really wanted to support them. That takes courage sometimes to initiate, especially with people you don't know, but I encourage you to do it. So you could potentially meet with someone here again. Or another way you could do this, these are just my 3 examples for you, is to find a soul friend, a spiritual director or a coach, someone else on the outside of your current experience to support you in your own thriving. So for you to be able to have that conversation and to have support with someone who could be a little bit of a mentor or a guide, helping you find the faithfulness of God in your own life. So those are just a few experiences. Anything else before we transition to this next space? Any questions or thoughts or feedback that you wanted to add before we move into the next moment? Okay.
I have a follow-up question on the being in a community of competent practices.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I'm okay with, I believe that, and we do have lay people, different ministries doing that. But when it comes to leadership, when there is an authoritative figure, and then, steps, they're not competing in a good way, but then competing with each other. And then when the leadership is not open, but kind of forcing, demanding, so like how can the leadership, a group of like leaders can actually have this atmosphere, especially when we pastors, we are good at speaking, but not so much of the practice. So like I was having breakfast this morning with some people, and then I confessed, we are good at saying things, but really horrible at practicing what we are preaching. So yeah, how can we really have this community of competent practice yeah, as Christian leaders? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That's a good question. I think that's a hard question because there's an integrity space there. Like there's the, I say this, I preach this, my life doesn't mirror this or reflect this back. And I don't know all of the dynamics for your experience of like who those leaders are, how that all works within your context. So that would be a hard question for me to answer too concretely. But let me see if I'm hearing you. You are saying that your that the leadership at your church or in your context is leading in one way, but speaking, or maybe speaking towards leadership and what you're supposed to be doing in one way, but you're not actually living in a way that has integrity with that. Is that correct? Did I hear that? Yeah?
You may say that.
Okay.
Yeah. What's being preached, that's another one actually that wasn't in my mind, but then, you know, we preach things at the pulpit, and, you know, that's the direction that we should have and how people should live. But then we're not really going after those words of proclamation.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I wonder about having honest conversations. Like if you're seeing that and hearing that, whether that's you personally or the people that you're working with, to be able to say, like if that's your pastor or your team, to be able to say, I wonder about this. I sense that this is not happening. Own where that's true for you too. But I don't have all the answers to that, to how we create that all the time. I don't know if anyone else has any other insight on that, but I would say that it's worth having conversations with probably other leaders and pastors you trust, and then also mostly your team. But it takes courage and humility to be able to have those conversations. I don't know that I answered you well, but I answered you in a way that I from the outside, it would be hard for me to coach that. Any other questions before we move on to we're almost finished. I just wanted to leave you with a couple thoughts before we conclude. But I wanted to give you some space to ask any questions before we conclude. Okay. The last thing that I wanted to share with you is I know that as I am engaged with pastors and leaders and watching our current cohorts, whether it's in our Thriving in Ministry group or our Thriving Congregations group, there's a lot going on. And there's a lot going on in our lives. I mean, one of my pastors who is newly a lead pastor, her husband's in the hospital currently with COVID pneumonia. And we know that this is all part of what's happening in our world. There's a lot going on everywhere. And there's a lot of things that are really heavy, and we hold those. And it's okay to hold both grief and joy together. It's also important for us to take breaks and to make sure that we take space to care for ourselves. So that way we can step out and be able to support the people within our congregation and our community. So I want to say to you that it's okay to rest, and it's okay to take care of yourself. Please take care of yourself. Please find restorative activity for you. Whatever that looks like. If that means in the middle of the day, you need to go exercise, but that doesn't feel like what you're supposed to do as a pastor in ministry, then go exercise. You can work it out somehow. Work out with your team, with your staff. Find ways that support your thriving with safe, wise guides, colleagues, but then also ways that help you to embody your calling to where you can stay aligned with that. this has been a year of a lot of burnout, a lot of heaviness. And so I just want to remind us to, first of all, that the fact that you're still in ministry and you're doing this work means you're resilient. It means you already are able to flex those muscles and do that work, and that God has given you everything you need to be able to do this good work. Now it's staying aligned, or as I tend to think of it, as like a sunflower, like keeping my face tuned into what God is up to, my face looking at the sun of God. And so I want to encourage you to just try to stay aligned. And that means a lot more than what's happening in this conversation today. That means taking small steps to have habits and practices that support you. It means taking time to step away and reflect. It means stepping together with others to be able to have safe space. And it also means modeling and teaching this to your team, teaching this to the people that are watching you, that you would be in alignment so that way they also can be discipled by you to do the same. And so I'll have some of these notes in what Chris will send out, but I just want to mention those things as an encouragement to you, because as we care for ourselves, we're able to care for others. If we believe in God's prevenient grace, then let's keep that on us so that way we can then go and do our work, not out of a punitive sense, but out of a grace-filled sense of God has called us and now we get to reflect that back into our communities.